All right, we'll immediately start. And just like the other panels, we're going to dispense with the long introductions because everyone here has so many accomplishments, but I'm only going to say in what reference what you're doing on this panel in particular. So this panel is entitled Sartorial Retrospective on the Republic of Vietnam, First Ladies Ao Dai. And I'm the chair, Professor Lien-Hang Nguyen of Columbia, and the moderator sitting next to me is Laurel Kendall, who teaches in anthropology, but is curator of Asian Ethnology, Curator-in-Charge of African and Pacific Ethnology at the American Museum of Natural History. We also have our panelists sitting to my left, Anne-Marie Leshkowich at College of the Holy Cross, Martina Nguyen right down the street at Baruch College, and Tuong all the way over from the West Coast, University of Oregon. He's also the founding director of U.S. Vietnam Research Center. So I'm going to throw it right over to the moderator, and we will explain how this panel will proceed.
Okay, so the panel's focused on materiality, on things visual, on exhibitionary presentations. So we will cut right to the presentations. We will start with the West Coast and our presenter, Tuong Vu. All yours.
Actually, before we begin, the three of us would like to make a joint, very brief statement about the values that we hold and the kind of intellectual community that we hope to build. We are here to support our scholarly colleagues at Columbia who are still committed to the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion at a time when leadership in both higher education and politics are abandoning these values and dismantling programs and institutions aimed at creating a society in which everyone is heard and valued. We come to showcase our research, which puts the stories of women and people of color, in our case, Vietnamese women, front and center in the history of the Vietnam War, a discourse that has been dominated by American and male perspectives at an institution and within a political climate in which intellectual freedom and integrity have been compromised. We thank everyone for being here and for listening to our stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Okay, now we will have our first presentation.
I must start first because all the trouble began with me, right? So, so I'm trained as a political scientist, and I study, in my career, I study state formation, revolutions, nationalism, and communism, and so on. But I know nothing about Ao Dai and fashion. So how did I get involved? So in 2019, a grad student from Vietnam who was studying in Europe and who got to know Madame Nguyen's, Nguyen Nguyen's family, because he was writing a master's thesis comparing Chiang Kai-shek, Madame Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Nguyen. And she introduced me to the family. So at that time, we already, had our center up and running for a few years, beginning with this conference in 2016 on the Republic of Vietnam as the experience of nation building. And then we went on to have, you could recognize a few of the speakers here, Adrienne, Trin, Nguyen, Vinh, at that great conference that we had in 2019 on the topic of studying republicanism as an ideology and doctrine that inform the leaders and the public of the Republic of Vietnam in its 2 decades of life, and it as an ideology that motivated many South Vietnamese, just like communism motivated many North Vietnamese. So we had this conference, and then we had this conference here just a couple of years ago, and Trịnh Hậu in the room was there as well, about Vietnamese Americans contending with the legacies of war and post-war trauma. And we had this great conference putting together Vietnamese community leaders and Vietnamese academics for great dialogue. We've published many books on South Vietnam, on the Republic of Vietnam, as you see. So one co-edited with Nguyen, who spoke earlier, one with Trinh, and about Vietnamese American studies, and also books we translated from English. One by Professor Olga Draw, and then the other one's Madame Ngu's memoirs that she wrote in the last years of her life. And it was written in French, and we translated to Vietnamese already, and the English version is coming out soon with Texas Tech University Press. So, the French manuscript also was donated to us together with other things that after I was introduced to Madame Ngu's relatives and her son-in-law, after she passed away in 2011, and her daughter also, Nguyen, passed away in 2012. The husband, who was an Italian, he later on he remarried, and he had a new partner, and he was moving out, and so he was looking for a trusted place to donate the possessions of Madame Ngu left behind by Madame Ngu. And we've been doing a lot of stuff on Republic of Vietnam at the time, and then so that's how we gained that trust, and so I know that the family has been betrayed many times before, so they are very, very suspectful of other people, but so it's hard to earn their trust, and so they earned their trust, and then donated her documents, at first her documents, and then her memoirs, and then also the 16 dresses that Madame Ngu wore, the dresses and the pants that she wore, and these dresses she took with her on her trip, out of Vietnam in the summer of '63, and she was never able to return because of the coup against President Diem. So they donated to us, and we were able to kind of start thinking. That was like 5 years ago. So I started to think of how to display them for public, and later on I am very grateful to my colleagues here, Professor Anne-Marie Leshkowich and Professor Martina Nguyen for taking responsibility for this, mostly because I know nothing about outside and fashion. So I leave it here for you. So.
Okay, thank you. Every exhibitionary project begins with fortuitous connections and incredible coincidences. All right, so let us proceed. Anne-Marie Leshkowich.
And can I have the...
Who told me about this project maybe a year ago, and I was just utterly blown away by it.
One of the things about exhibition work is it really does take a village, or in our case, it's a small city of dedicated people, from the consultants behind the scenes who help. This is the first exhibition that I've been a part of, and I think that's the same.
Yes.
And so to know that we knew nothing, and to be generous in supporting us as we learned, and then the team at Holy Cross, where the exhibition will be in its first iteration. We do hope it will travel, more on that later. But the team at Holy Cross, from the preparator to the catalog designer to the people who create the different podiums and are designing the exhibition in that way, to student researchers who've helped us to dive into the history of some of these garments. It has just been an incredible collaborative effort. So I want to take a few minutes and introduce some of the elements of the exhibition. First of all, the name of it, the Vietnamese Ao Dai in a Time of War, Fashion, Citizenship, and Nationalism, 1954 to 1975. The goal of the exhibition is to take an innovative approach to the war by exploring the role that Vietnam's so-called national costume played within Vietnam, both the Republic of Vietnam and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and on the global stage. The centerpiece of the exhibition are ao dai, as Tuong has already mentioned, that were worn by key figures in the Republic, including garments from Chun Le-Suan, President Ngo Dinh-Diem's sister-in-law, also known as Madame Nhu, and Nguyễn Thị Mai An, President Nguyễn Văn Thieu's wife, also known as Madame Thieu. These historically significant garments, many of which appeared on magazine covers and in other media at the time, have never before been publicly displayed. So I'm going to give you a taste of what the exhibition has in store by showing you some of the garments, and I'm going to focus on Madame Nhu. We can, oh, I have the, yes. So it's this one for next. Okay. So we have garments that were worn by Chun Le-Suan, as well as at times during the US tour, her daughter, her oldest child, who was with her on the tour, would wear some of the garments. So the trip began on September 9th, 1963. Some of the garments that Madame Nhu brought with her are ones that she had worn previously in different appearances in Vietnam, some of which were covered in the media. So we have the garment as it will be in the exhibition and as it appeared on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. This garment was worn during events surrounding the Chung Sisters, International Women's Day, and also events related to the Women's Paramilitary Corps. The first stop on the trip was in Belgrade for a meeting of the Interparliamentary Union, of which Madame Nhu was a member as an elected member of the National Assembly in the Republic. Very famous photo of her having lunch with Senator Ted Kennedy, who by all accounts did not necessarily wish to have lunch with her at the time, given what was happening in the relationship between the US and the Diem regime. But have lunch they did, and this made the front pages of newspapers in the United States. She then spent time in Rome, where she had a very noteworthy press conference about the Buddhist crisis and some of the comments that she had made, quite incendiary comments that had gone viral, as it were, at the time. So this is a press conference on September 23rd, 1963, and she is wearing the ao dai on the left. It is also a garment that she had worn previously. This is as she's reviewing the Women's Paramilitary Corps, and that is her youngest child, her daughter, at her side. They spent time, again, in Rome, but also in Paris, and that is Lê Thuy in a garment that her mom had worn several years prior, also a Chung Sisters celebration, and as photographed while shopping and appearing in Life magazine. So Madame Nhu and her daughter arrive in New York City on October 7th, 1963. And in addition to New York, the cities visited on the tour included Washington, Chicago, San Francisco, Dallas, Austin, Phoenix, and Los Angeles. It was not an official state visit, and the Kennedy administration was very careful to note that as early and often as they could. But it was a public relations publicity tour to attempt to present her side of what was happening in South Vietnam. Many, many speaking engagements, including here at Columbia, as well as Sarah Lawrence, Harvard, Princeton, Fordham, Georgetown, North Carolina State College in Raleigh, Howard, Northwestern, UT Austin, UC Berkeley, and then venues such as the Overseas Press Club, the National Press Club, and this major television appearance on Meet the Press. On November 1st, while Madame Nhu and Lê Thuy were in Los Angeles, the coup happened. And this is the garment that she wore in the days following the coup, November 1st, November 2nd, going to Mass at Church of the Good Shepherd in Los Angeles, as well as making statements to the press. She ultimately left for Rome on November 13th, where she was reunited with her 3 other children who had left Vietnam in the aftermath of the coup, a pretty harrowing journey that they had in the days following the coup. I want to just say a little bit about my work to date and how it relates to the exhibition.
I'm a cultural anthropologist. My research has largely focused on contemporary issues surrounding Ao Dai, especially starting in the mid-1990s, a revival of interest in it as an expression of national cultural heritage, of femininity, and as conversant with global fashion as well. So in working on the exhibition, I've come to a deeper appreciation of the styles of Ao Dai in the Republic in particular, in the 1960s and the 1970s, and especially the so-called Madame Yu Ao Dai associated with a boat neck and sometimes three-quarter sleeves. That this is a key moment in the history of the garment. I've narrated that in prior publications, but I've come to see the importance of this stylistic contribution and also to place the figure of Madame Yu to put in the same frame her speech acts and all the attention that they generated, as well as her dress acts. And to see this as an intentional representation of a claim to a form of Vietnamese identity and cultural heritage we talked earlier on a panel about issues of legitimacy. And so an attempt to claim a Vietnamese identity that would also be legible globally. It also places for me in context, the 1990s tendency to embrace a form of the Ao Dai that was seen as more traditional and iconic, particularly with the stand-up collar, longer sleeves, as kind of a reaction against the stylistic innovation that we saw in the earlier Republic. But now that stylistic innovation has come back again. And we see all sorts of styles of Ao Dai becoming very popular in Vietnam today. And so in both these moments, the 1960s, and then for me on my journey of research in the Ao Dai, the 1990s, when my work began, the Ao Dai is a kind of soft power claim to Vietnamese national identity, both domestically, but also on the international stage. And this was particularly important during a time of civil and global war, just as it has become particularly important in a time of global economic integration. I'm going to turn it over to Martina to say a little bit more about the overall themes of the exhibition.
Xin chào cả nhà. I just want to thank everyone again for being here today and hearing our stories and for the opportunity. Thank you to Lien-Hang for the opportunity to share our research with you today. I guess what I want to do now is to go over a little bit our aims for this exhibition. What are we trying to do? What are the sort of interventions and narratives that we're trying to, I guess, inject into the history of the Vietnam War? And then after that, I'll do the what Anne-Marie did as well, is to talk about my own work and how my own work on the Ao Dai sort of dovetails with the exhibition and what my own work brings to the exhibition. So what are we trying to do with this exhibition? Well, first of all, public discourse on the Vietnam War in the United States has been dominated by American perspectives. I mean, you wouldn't know it to be here today, but it is. But focusing a lot on sort of the perspective of American military leaders, for example, soldiers on the ground, student protesters, and scholars, a number of whom are in this room today, in recent years have begun to acknowledge and to incorporate the roles and voices of Vietnamese participants in the war, although there is much work to be done to highlight the historical agency of Vietnamese. Even still, given the hypermasculine and violent nature of war, almost all of these perspectives are male. The Vietnamese diaspora in the United States, as arguably the most significant legacy of the war itself, is often portrayed as an afterthought and marginalized in public histories of the war, both as historical actors and as a constituent part of the quote-unquote American audience. So what we're trying to do with this exhibition is it is a public-facing corrective to the US-centric and male-centric discourse on the Vietnam War. First, it places the focus squarely on Vietnamese experiences, voices, and perspectives, both past and present. In particular, we want to celebrate the Vietnamese diaspora in the United States by writing Vietnamese Americans directly into the history of the Ao Dai. Second, The exhibition explicitly makes women and gender central to the analysis of the war. Third, it presents a view of the Vietnam War from an everyday, on-the-ground perspective through the lens of one aspect of material culture. And fourth and final, I'm done with my list now, the exhibition prompts reflection on the role of national costumes and first ladies and clothing and gender more generally in the construction and representation of national identity domestically and internationally. So a little bit about my own work. I'm a historian by training, but I'm not a specialist of the Vietnam War. In fact, my focus is on the French colonial period. And the focal point of my research up until this point is on the history, the early history of the Áo Dài. In particular, I've done extensive research into the life and the work of Nguyen Tuong, a fashion designer who called himself Le Mur. He lived in the 1930s, and he's often cited as the inventor, quote unquote, inventor of the Áo Dài. How my work sort of dovetails with the exhibition and what my work brings to the exhibition. Well, first, national costumes, as my work has shown, are constructed phenomena. The nation-building process, as we've talked about earlier in previous panels, often involves reconstituting the past and inventing traditions, both to authenticate a fabricated, unified national mythology and to mask the novelty of the nation-state form. This can be seen in cases quite famous all around the world, throughout the 19th and the 20th century, where inventive nationalists have created costumes, borrowing from regional costumes, local peasant dress, for example, to visually represent a unified modern national identity. So here we have a few cases, the Mexican China poblana, the Indian sari, the Korean hanbok, and actually probably one of, a famous 19th century case, that of the Scottish tartan kilt, which wasn't actually invented by Scottish people, but it was actually designed by an English Quaker industrialist and made popular by a British military officer. So we can see the sort of examples of this kind of sartorial nationalism over all around the world. And the Áo Dài is a case and study for Vietnam. The Áo Dài, today the Áo Dài is universally accepted as the symbol of Vietnamese identity. But that said, it was not always the case. There were clothes that looked similar to the Áo Dài from the 19th century Nguyen court. But these, I would argue, are viewed just as clothing or y phục, right? Clothing the body. The idea of national costume or quốc phục, the idea that a country must have a garment that reflected its identity was introduced and constructed by Le Mur Nguyen Tuong during the colonial era. In 1934, he introduced a garment called the Áo Le Mur, which is often cited as the predecessor to the modern Áo Dài, as we see here. As you can see, the Áo Le Mur does not really resemble today's modern Áo Dài. But what I argue is that Le Mur's contribution to the Áo Dài is not in the design. It's not in the design or the form of the garment itself, but in the cultural production of a national costume. He was basically the first person to say that Vietnam, the modern nation of Vietnam, must have a costume that reflected its identity. The second aspect of my work that I bring to the exhibition is the notion that gender ideals are deeply tied into national identity. When Le Mur introduced his garment in 1934, he actually invented it to be a woman's outfit. During the colonial period, men were allowed to wear the three-piece suit, the Western three-piece suit, without modification. But women were expected to wear clothing that was mediated through the nation and to reflect their new changing roles as wives to nationalist men and mothers to future citizens. Vietnamese women cannot just wear what Western women wore. So what I argue is that new gender ideologies were being formulated in this moment, and they play a huge role in the history of the Ao Dai writ small and actually writ large, the construction of modern Vietnamese identity. Thank you. So I can think we move to Q&A now. Is that the plan?
Okay, this
Oh,
is,
no, there's Tuong. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Well,
Yeah.
Laurel's
Oh,
gonna
sorry.
questions.
Oh,
Oh, Laura's gonna go ask.
I'm going to ask a question that involves all of these because this is very exciting stuff.
oops.
As an American child in the 50s, in the 60s, encountering the world through the covers of Time Life, I was, and then reading your preparatory remarks, I was struck by, two images that sort of blurred for me. And one was of Madame Nguyen, and one was Madame Chiang Kai-shek. I'm not surprised that the root of all this discussion is a student comparing these two women and how their media images were so much a part of what they wore, these very form-fitting translations of a looser traditional dress, and how those images contributed to a sexualized images of Asian women. And so, when Martina says the purpose of this project is to demasculinize, make it less US-centric, less male-centric, I'm thinking two questions arise. One, when something like these particular precious reliquary garments that are at the center of your show went into the media, was there a certain loss of control in how they're read, the impact they have, which is a kind of global impact? And then the second is related to your larger neighborhood of nationalist dress, the creation of nationalist dress. There's a nationalist dress for women, but the men don't wear it. And this is very common in the world. This was kind of policy in Meiji Japan. We see it in many other places. So I wonder where this demasculinizing comes into the story. There's a friction there, and how are you going to navigate the friction? So maybe Martina, you and then your colleagues might also contribute to that.
Yeah. So about your first question, Laurel, that about the loss of control and how Ao Dai were read, we definitely see the case with Madame Nguyen in her press coverage during her trip to the United States in 1963. She wore these very elaborate Ao Dai, these beautiful Ao Dai that were supposed to send a message about what South Vietnam was about, what this sort of modern identity of South Vietnam is about. But it was, that said, it was drowned out by American press coverage of Madame Nguyen. This is where, the sort of the discourse sort of lost control, right? I mean, she was called the Dragon Lady. She was called, she was kind of given this kind of epithet of, power hungry and vicious, and there's an obvious sort of sexism and Orientalism that's being that's being advanced here. And of course, her very, very controversial claims did not help at all. But yes, I mean, in terms of her sort of sartorial, I mean, that's the thing about fashion, right? It can be read in so many different ways. And in this case, we can see that kind of spun out of control. And yeah.
So that's a challenge for you. Do you want to add to that, Anne-Marie?
I would also want to differentiate the kind of media that we're talking about. One of the things that I've been working on, I have the luxury of being on sabbatical this year, so I've been able to take a deeper dive into trying to trace the history of these garments and the media coverage of them in the United States as well as in Vietnam. And by the way, earlier there was a question about access to archives. I have been finding that the archives, particularly the National Archives II in Saigon, are very open. The General Sciences Library, where the periodicals of the Republic are housed, not so much. It's a little harder to get into the world, the sociocultural world of the Republic within Vietnam. So resources like Library of Congress, Cornell, other repositories of this information, also the video footage that is now held in the United States from that period, is offering a clearer window into daily life and the coverage of famous people in the Republic. So there's an interesting, the neckline is referred to as quite daring and challenging. It's described as low and immodest. Internationally, there was also some pushback about it. So for example, there was some coverage in Paris Match of her, and a Vietnamese woman living in France wrote in that it is wonderful to see the ao dai on the international stage as a symbol of the nation. However, it would be so much better if it were the traditional form of the garment, with the higher neck representing the modesty that Vietnamese women should have. And so that's kind of the complexity of, we're going to show the boat. Oh, thank you. Yes.
We're gonna just switch to my
Yeah.
presentation.
And then I will also say that the US media was quite mystified by her words and her appearance. So there are all of these juxtapositions that, as Martina was saying, are sexist and orientalist in terms of dainty but dangerous. That she is in a sheath of silk and her words are as sharp and pointed as her lacquered fingernails. So there's a lot of play on her appearance. JFK is reported to have referred to her as that goddamn bitch. And there were lots of very personal attacks. There's also a very interesting conversation in the Oval Office as they're talking about a possible coup in which some of the portions are redacted, but they appear to be making claims about the hours-long interview with a CIA handler that she had just had in Paris on October 1st, and what might have happened if you're spending several hours one-on-one with her. In a hotel room in Paris. So this is in the Oval Office. So the US press really ramps up this highly sexualized discourse. But again, the nature of the garment was also getting some critique for departing from traditional styles, even as it was also appreciated as very fashion forward.
Okay. And then, Professor Wu, I'm sorry, I thought your remarks were your presentation. We have more, please.
Yeah, I do have more. And actually, yeah, what you see on the slide in the middle is Madame Nhu, right? And on your right, that's Madame Theo to the far left. And at also another Hai Ba Chung celebration day in South Vietnam. So I came to this project, and I thought about those questions about masculinization and so on, but I care more about Vietnamese and their history, right? Not whatever Americans thinking. I care more about what Vietnamese were thinking, right? And North and South Vietnam, how are they different, right? So that's so my focus is on Vietnamese, and Vietnamese. I'm really interested. I became very interested, after editing the memoirs, Madame Nhu's memoir, and kind of studying these women. I found their lives and their legacies fascinating as historical figures in their own right. And next is the image of the Manila Summit in 1966, when Madame Theo sitting next to the third to the right, next to Imelda Marcos in 1966, when they had this summit among leaders of Southeast CETO, or Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, and Americans, and I think Lyndon Johnson, to talk about South Vietnamese defense. So I'm the second reason that I want to get out of this exhibit is that the contrast between North and South Vietnam, the contrast between the women, the contrast between the men, and their politics is quite interesting. So Madame Nhu, I found that she had a strong personality. She was politically engaged, socially reformist, culturally influential, whereas Madame Thieu's role was limited to, ceremonial and social functions. And Madame Bin, she was also in a very Nguyễn Thị Bình, she was also wearing áo dài, but her role is more constrained than Madame Nhu. And Madame Nguyễn Thị Định is a fighter of the NLF, the National Liberation Front. She was a peasant fighter. And also I talk more about Ho Chi Minh versus Ngô Đình Diệm and North Vietnam's first ladies. Should I talk all about them now? Yeah. Okay. You could see that Madame Nguyễn Thị Định was the second to your left, and Nguyễn Thị Bình top right. On Madame Nguyễn Thị Bình, there were many other women who were politically loyal and savvy like her, but I think she was chosen to represent the NLF because of a combination of her ability, her pedigree. She was the granddaughter of Phan Châu Trinh, a revolutionary, and also her bourgeoisie background. And she would fit well with the whole team of the NLF leadership, right? So Nguyễn Hữu Thọ, Huỳnh Tấn Phát, Trương Như Tạng, etc. They were all coming from the bourgeois background because the party, the North Vietnam at that time, was trying to court bourgeoisie support in the South for the revolution. So Nguyễn Thị Bình did wear áo dài a lot, but often with something outside to cover it, even when indoors. And she made good use of the black and white scarf, as you see in the picture, to express her revolutionary commitments, sharing them not only with Nguyễn Thị Định, but also Yasser Arafat and Pol Pot, the revolutionaries at the time. And these two pictures excellent to understand the contrast between these two women. I know Madame Bin looked differently in other pictures, but this picture is telling because it shows her in a less viewed and less talked about role, her submissive role as a cadre, as an apparatchik. And this morning, Nữ Anh talked about, how riders in North Vietnam were under very tight control of the party. And Madame Bin's role in NLF was also similarly heavily scripted. The way she sat and looked admiringly and humbly at Chairman Mao, she looked just like the students I receive in my office. This posed a stark contrast with Madame Nhu as someone speaking her mind and challenging powerful Western men. You could see Western men all around her, right? But she's just, kind of asserting her voice and her personality, whereas Madame Bin was kind of, so you could see that, Madame Bin was playing a very different role than Madame Nhu. And that was not just because it was imposed on her, but she was content with it. If you follow her whole career, she never said anything that deviated from the party line. So her whole career, she was content with that role, and the role suited her well as a person. So this is between Ho Chi Minh and Ngô Đình Diệm. So the picture to your left is commonly thought as taken on September 2nd, 1945, when Ho read the Declaration of Independence. So if you are Vietnamese living in Vietnam, that's the picture that you see on TV, on newspapers, and so on, every year on the commemoration of this day. But it's recently revealed that Ho Chi Minh was not dressed like that. And that picture was reconstructed in the 1950s. Ho Chi Minh was actually looked like that on your right, wearing a Western suit with the pith hat that often wore by the French. So he certainly looked far less dignified, right, and healthy, in the real picture when he, at the time, which is understandable because he just came out of the jungle hideout, right, in Tân Trào, Thái Nguyên, right? He spent his whole time there since 1941. and he looked like he was having malaria, right? But then the doctor picture, the reconstructed picture, looked very healthy and strong. So that's the reason, the aesthetic reason for that, right? But also there's a political reason, because in the early 1950s, when the reconstruction took place, Ho had come out of the closet as a dedicated communist, working for the Comintern for more than 2 decades. The Mao suit, which he wore to your left, in the image to your left, set him quite well in line with the Soviet Union and Maoist China. This morning, a student asked about a counterfactual in his exam, right? So I can give a counterfactual. What would have happened if Ho had worn a Mao suit in 1945, on September 2nd, 1945? What would have happened?
Okay.
Okay, I have a few more, just
Okay.
a couple more. Yeah. So this Nguyen, just like maybe 2 more. So Nguyen also displays the politics of alliance to some extent, but his clothing more significantly reflected the native Vietnamese urban culture at the time, which was mixed between traditional and Western elements, and very consistent like that. So I turn to the first ladies of North Vietnam later. Yeah, and that's very an interesting topic too. But please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, this is the larger context.
Right.
Male dress, female dress, who's cosplay. Okay. Now you've been working on an exhibit, all of you, and you're all, real scholars who usually, do either ethnographic research or work in libraries. Suddenly you have the possibilities and constraints of material stuff and space to show it in and resource to show it in. Working on the exhibit, what did you learn from the project? Let's start with Anne-Marie and work down.
So I'll actually say 2 things, but I'll say them quickly. And I can show some photos later to support what I say, or during the Q&A if anyone's interested. The first thing is, or I guess maybe the overarching thing is, working on an exhibition with material objects enables you to question taken for granted stories about how things go. The objects themselves, in their materiality, in their physical composition, they provoke questions. So one, this follows on what Tuong was just saying. I've questioned some of the narratives I have in my head about Ao Dai in the Democratic Republic and in the Republic. So the story that I had heard was Ao Dai kind of disappear from the Democratic Republic in terms of daily life. Nguyen Thi Binh is wearing them in Paris. She's wearing them in her diplomatic events. They're worn ceremonially, but in everyday life, maybe not so much. Versus in the South, you have a real embracing of the Ao Dai, particularly in Saigon. And it's a part of popular culture. Meanwhile, the militaristic model of femininity, that's a Democratic Republic of Vietnam thing, versus the South, where you see, again, I have a Saigon focus, a more urban consumer focused, middle class kind of image of femininity that does not involve being martial. Well, someone like Madame Nhu really questions that, because, there is that famous / infamous photo of her shooting a gun wearing an Ao Dai. I'll say, by the way, if you go into the archives, you see all the photos that were taken before that key shot, where she looks like she knows what she's doing, and all that follow. She doesn't know what she's doing. It is clear she has not shot a gun before. There is this kind of, she puts her hand over her face. So the fact that it's that photo that circulates, that presents an image of her, if you look at the series, it is hard for women to be in the position to take up arms when they have not had this training, when it's not been expected. So her promotion of the Women's Paramilitary Corps was really her interpretation of feminism. She told the paramilitary corps trainees that women will not achieve equality in Vietnam until they're recognized as citizens who are equally capable of risking their lives in service of the nation. And so that's, to think of her in an Ao Dai saying that message, to try to fuse these things and not have this bifurcated image of femininity. And the second thing that has surprised me, so we have the first is more of a convergence about martial images of femininity between North and South, also to see that the Ao Dai is being used diplomatically by the North, by the NLF, the PRG as well. The second thing has to do with the white Ao Dai uniform. Much more complicated history there of high school students wearing the garment. And I've had a chance to dig deeply into the post-war revival of it in Southern Vietnam, where it was not about the reemergence of class distinction, but it was actually being celebrated by a principal in Cà Mau who had gone north in 1954 and received her education there, returned to the Mekong Delta, became a high school principal, and at the suggestion of Nguyen Thi Binh, created the idea of the Ao Dai becoming a uniform again. She saw it as leveling class distinctions and enabling women, young women, to have the honor of representing what she saw as the national soul in Vietnamese clothing. So again, engaging with these garments and the claims being made about them and the ways in which different actors are engaging with the garment to make these claims at various moments in time. That's been something that I've really learned a lot by working on the exhibition.
Okay, Martina, what surprised you? What was your big takeaway from this experience?
Oh my goodness. I'm a historian. So basically we sit in archives looking at pieces of paper and stuff on paper, right? And so for me, what really surprised me is the materiality itself of these objects. Like, I mean, the small things that we have discovered about these garments that shed light to the women, shed light on the women and the people who wore them, right? So for example, Madame Yu's Ao Dai, there's makeup on the collar, right? There are holes left behind by her brooches. There are armpit stains. There's all sorts of these sort of small details that only by handling a historical artifact in real life that you can experience. Like, we were able to see on some of the garments worn places that suggest that this was a loved favorite outfit. And of course, like Anne-Marie, I wasn't there at the time, but unfortunately, I was so sad I missed this, but Anne-Marie texted me in like this tizzy when they were mounting the Ao Dai on mannequins to be photographed. She said, when I steamed Madame Thio's Ao Dai, the smell of 1970s Saigon emerged from these garments. And, I was like, well, what did it smell like? And she said, humidity, faded perfume, and cigars. And so for me, like, this for me is the most kind of surprising thing of all, because like I'm a fashion historian, but most of my sources are designs drawn on paper, right? To see these objects in real life is so exciting. And then of course, the knowledge that these very artifacts were present and worn at very key moments of Vietnamese history, right? We have the Ao Dai that Madame Nhu wore when she found out her husband and brother-in-law were killed. We have Ao Dai that most likely Madame Thio was grabbing out of her closet in the presidential palace as she was fleeing in April of 75. So for me, like those are the things that really surprise me, the immediacy of these objects. And also the photos do not do these garments any justice. They are stunning. And as a kid that grew up in rural Podunk, Texas, I would never imagine that I would be so lucky or privileged to be able to work with these objects. So yeah, that's what.
As a museum person, I really can relate to your enthusiasm. These are the kind of object traces that turn a representative object into a relic and a witness. You hear the expression witnessing object. Very exciting. Okay, Tuong, do you want to add anything to this? What struck you in the exhibitionary planning process? Something you didn't have before that wouldn't have gotten if you hadn't gotten involved in this project?
Yeah, I think when I received the outside worn by Madame New, opened the boxes and saw them and kind of held them up. It was also kind of an difficult to describe feeling, like this. That there was certainly a sense of the 50s. No, maybe I don't know, maybe, but it was clearly, kind of a memorable moment when I held these things on my hand. And I already mentioned my discovery of Uncle Ho's clothing, what he wore on September 2nd. So I move on this question.
Okay, let's open it up to all of you, and your burning questions come up to the mic, and try to keep the question concise, and we'll get you some concise answers.
Maybe actually I just have two last slides. I can show.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll
before we
prompt
move
some
on.
questions.
Why you guys
My
prepare for
students,
questions.
come on, line up.
So, well, I felt like, like since we talk about the first ladies of South Vietnam, so it would be fair just to talk also about the first ladies of North Vietnam. Who were those first ladies? And also we can see a sharp contrast between North and South Vietnam. While first ladies of the South were public figures, as you see, those in the North were hidden, and their existence was often denied. So Lê Duẩn denied, he had one wife, and then his second wife he took when he was in the South. He denied the relationship until after the war, after he died. And Ho Chi Minh is known to have had many women in his life, but they were never acknowledged. So North Vietnamese leaders were career revolutionaries, right? They were not like military men like Nguyễn Văn Thiệu or politician like Ngô Đình Diệm. But like they were also men, right? So they if they had spouses or sexual life, that's normal. But then in the propaganda, they were raised to the level of superheroes or gods. That's why their private life was not mentioned in public, and the first ladies oftentimes had to be carefully hidden or denied, if that was not legitimate. And then finally, I wanted to show a few difference in the school uniform that if there had North Vietnamese student, high school student did not have uniform, and you could see from this picture taken of the students in the school in Hải Phòng. It was the city, but then the students were wearing mostly dark clothes, and if you look at the feet of some of them, there was no shoes. They were bare feet. And I wrote to the person who provided the picture, and he said most students at the time did not have footwear, did not wear shoes to school, did not wear even slippers. They just did not have them. Whereas in South Vietnam, this was a picture of students in Quảng Ngãi Female High School, and then Teresa High School in Con Tum, and a public high school in Bình Sơn, Quảng Ngãi. So you could see that like the school uniform reflected South Vietnam's more urban and more cosmopolitan culture, as well as a more diverse intellectual culture, as well as higher living standard. That's all I have.
Okay, let's open it up. We'll take maybe 2 questions and get some responses, please.
Hi, I'm Callisto again. I was wondering why you think, or like in your time kind of investigating the Ao Dai and its history in terms of like a construction of nation states and nationalism, why do you think that women's garbs in particular are this sort of object of this construction? Like, because in my mind, it's obviously it makes sense that a patriarchal society would have more mobility for men in terms of like they're allowed to occupy different spaces and their expectations are more malleable. But I just wonder why we have why, and also I guess making a prescription of how women should act also makes sense if you're trying to create a rigid patriarchal society. But I wonder why it's so fundamental to the like conception of a nation to have like a woman at the head or a woman's garb as like the cultural touchstone for what makes you a nation. Like what about women's fashion in particular provides that unity that maybe like a more like a masculine sort of garb wouldn't, or because of that sort of necessity for malleability, why that kind of disallows that? Thank you.
Big question. Okay. Well, do you want to respond to that? Oh, okay. Let's take one more.
Hi, I'm Walter. I'm an undergraduate here in Pursuant course. My question is about, you spoke a lot about your attempt to move the scholarship away from studies based on like the male side of the history. And that sort of reminded me of the morning's panel about the sort of trying to move scholarship away from the military focus, the martial focused side of history. And so my question is like in American history and sort of other countries, we learn about how wartime affords women the opportunity to sort of move into roles in government and society that they wouldn't otherwise have. And so, considering that the RVN was so defined by its war with North, like, could you maybe could any of you maybe speak to the way the specific opportunities that the sort of wartime pressure afforded women to take on roles that they maybe would not have been able to take on in a sort of peacetime democratic republic, or not democratic, regular republic in a democracy? I'm thinking, perhaps before the military coup against Yemen, but after obviously the war started.
These are two gendered questions: how women dress and how women dress to represent nation and what women do. Who wants to lead off on this? Martina?
I'll start actually. So with the first question, please, because actually that's kind of central to my own work. In a way, you've already answered your question, right? Because, who is actually doing the construction? It is a patriarchy. Who's actually formulating the Vietnamese national identity that is emerging in the 1930s? It's men. And so so in a sense, like it's Lemure telling women what to do, telling women what their bodies should look like, telling them how the relationship between their clothes and their bodies, right? Because clothes is not just clothes, it's also about how we exist in society, right? Our bodies and how they are clothed exist in society. So, in itself, fundamentally, clothing is political. The patriarchy is at the heart of this sort of notion that men could wear whatever they want. They could wear Western clothes if they want, but women have to be mediated through the idea of the nation. And to answer specifically your question, why women, right? Why are men imagining women's, this gendered national identity and of clothing as part of it? It is biological. It is because women give birth. It is this biological image is a very powerful metaphor at the same time when they are also thinking about giving birth to a nation, right? So these two kind of like powerful biological metaphors, giving birth to a nation, and who gives birth? It's a woman. This is why we see the image of women across the nation state form throughout the 19th century and the 20th century, right? In France, we have Marianne. In Vietnam, we have the Áo Dài. And then you see this phenomenon of like men wearing Western clothes without modification and women wearing a nationalist costume. Duplicated across colonial Asia. You see this in Indonesia. You see this in Burma, right? So this is I would say the answer to that is the metaphor of giving birth.
Anyone else? Okay, let us go on to two more questioners. Olga, we'll start with you.
I'm Olga Dror still. Yeah. So I would like, it's a comment on the question. First of all, I think there was I know that there was a huge difference in approaches to clothes in North and South Vietnam. And in my book on youth, I explored it because South Vietnam was inundated with Western culture. And for them, a lot of intellectuals, they thought that actually the bigger danger was to lose Vietnameseness rather than to lose the war, that youth would lose its Vietnameseness because of the appearance of hippies and the bell-bottom pants and glasses and everything. So this was really true, while the North tried to stick with socialist realism, and that's why the clothes differed. But I'm just wondering, also those pictures, they are very telling, but the North was so poor. They could not, even if they wanted, they could not afford it. I remember, again, working on my book, I talked with a child poet, and he told me about his life and how he started writing. And I asked him, were you paid when you were sending those poems? And he was published widely. And he said, no, but once in a while, someone from the publishing house would come and buy me a bowl of pho, and I would never have it otherwise. And so I'm just thinking here, I'm sure that in the South, not all the girls could afford also to wear aozai. Where are we talking only? The comparison is very interesting, but I'm thinking about how selective it is, right? Because well, there are two points there, that one part was much poorer and they couldn't afford, and the other part, I'm not saying that they were very wealthy, but there were more people who could afford it, and not all of them in the South could do it. So I'm just questioning how reliable you think this comparison is. Thank you.
Okay, one more.
The last three.
Hello. What struck me, Ao Yai for a long time is, kind of a symbol of everyday life. And over time, it's become kind of like formalized, right? Into, reinscribed into politics. And, the first ladies wearing these events, these Ao Yai to very formal events. And in that way, it kind of replaced the, was it Ao Tak, as the formal dress. And I was wondering, what do you think this kind of formalization reveals about the nation building project?
Okay, these are kind of related. The formalization related to the nation building project. And Olga's question touches on something that came up in the previous panel, memory, selective memory, selectivity context. Okay, would you like to start, Tuong?
Yes. I take the criticism. I think it needs more careful study to see, like how the differences were, and also, like certainly in the South, there were poorer places that where students could not, afford the outside and so on. But I was showing, pictures in Kon Tum and Quảng Ngãi, which were not, really, not Saigon, not wealthy. So it was, they were equivalent to Hải Phòng in a way. But then the bigger point, and I also mentioned, living standards, in the South, was much higher than in the North. But then also there's another point, which is the ideological reason too. So in the North, the communist government considered outside a symbol of bourgeois culture, so they did not encourage it, and that's why it slowly disappeared in North Vietnam. And so when North Vietnam took over South Vietnam, outside also disappeared, right? So, well, in South Vietnam, even though South Vietnam was the same South Vietnam, right? So it became a lot poorer, certainly. But then, the Ao Dai also disappeared for more than a decade before it came back, as Anne-Marie discussed this earlier, yeah.
Actually, if I can follow up on that, Olga, it's a great question because I had similar ideas, which is why, to go back to the reemergence of the high school uniform Ao Dai in Southern Vietnam after the war, I was really surprised. It was the 1983 to 84 school year in which this principal in Cà Mau, with a revolutionary background herself, reintroduced it after extensive consultation with parents, teachers, students, and officials in the province. And the officials basically said, well, it is kind of a bourgeois thing, but if everybody agrees to it, okay. Her idea was it would level class distinctions because you could have one garment, wash it each night, hang it to dry, wear it the next day. She was concerned that regular clothing, aka more Western style clothing, was showing increasing class distinction within the school, particularly between rural students and students living in the township of Cà Mau. And so I was surprised to hear this. As an anthropologist, I learned the most from living human beings when I have a chance to engage with them. And she said, yes, during that time, people in the cities were starting to engage in trade. There was smuggling going on, things like that. There was wealth happening, and that was coming through in their daily dress. Putting all the young women in an ao dai and them all having the honor, the privilege of representing the nation in that dress, to her, that was an equalizing force. So again, the kind of class politics surrounding the ao dai and which is the more economical garment. That interview with her kind of really made me question some of my assumptions about the ao dai as bourgeois, as luxurious. She got a lot of critique for this. There was a meeting where a cadre from the Department of Culture and Information stood up and condemned it for bringing back the puppet regime garment and styles. And she stood up and said, no, this is our heritage. And as long as I'm principal, ao dai are going to flutter in the schoolyard. And there was silence in the hall, but then by all accounts, everybody in attendance stood up and applauded. And the ao dai uniform then kind of spread throughout the country after that. But again, it's pre-Doi Moi, so it's not at this moment seen as a sign of class prosperity.
Okay.